And this particular dialogue is on cooperative security in Northeast Asia. And it gives me very great pleasure to introduce Keith Krause. He's a senior research fellow for the Toda Peace Institute, where he's responsible for the program on cooperative security and arms control and disarmament. He's professor of international relations at the Geneva Graduate Institute and director of its Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building. And he's had a long career working on small arms reductions, on development and peace building, and on ensuring that there's a non-violent world. He's a Swiss Canadian, which is good. And he received his DPhil in international relations, and he was also a Rhodes Scholar, which is a wonderful achievement in itself. Kai is Professor of International Relations at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. He served as a non-resident senior scholar at the USIP, unfortunately now called the Trump Institute of Peace, which irritates the hell out of me. And he was a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, Harvard, China, and the World Program. So welcome to you too, Kai. And I'll start off with the first question here. How should we assess the implications of a possible Trump-Xi G2 summit and framework for regional and global peace? What opportunities and risks does intensified great power engagement present? Over to you, Kai.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the question. Yes, indeed, the Trump-Xi meeting last year indeed helped cool down the temperature of trade war temporarily. We have the talk about the G2 framework. G2 means group of two, which is US and China, they manage the situation together. That kind of framework can help make the US-China relation or competition more predictable, which is very, very good. However, it will not eliminate or erase the deep-seated strategic distrust between those two great powers. The reason is simple, because the competition between those two countries is structural. It is not depending on who will sit in the White House or in Zhongnanhai. Yes, the G2 framework can definitely help the situation, okay, but the problem is if those two countries, they do not manage the relation well, we will see a future escalation of their problem. That said, leaders do matter. They cannot, eliminate or avoid the competition, but they can shape how the competition is conducted, either peacefully or, unpeacefully. So in that sense, the G2 framework or the G2 concept can help those two countries, can serve as a guardrail between those two countries, can help them to avoid or prevent the potential escalation of their potential crisis in the future. However, there's a problem or a risk. If the G2 framework turns to an informal sphere of influence between those two countries in the region, then the middle or the small power will pay the price. Because as a famous old saying in Southeast Asia goes, if two elephants fight, then the grass around them will suffer. However, if when two elephants they get along and make love, then the grass around them also suffers. So that means the key issue is how those two countries they can manage the competition without trampling others' interests in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, and we can certainly do with more love. For decades, regional multilateralism has been a cornerstone of peace and security in the Asia-Pacific, and ASEAN-led institutions such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit, the Asian Defense Ministers meetings and so forth have provided inclusive platforms for dialogue, confidence building, cooperative security. But in recent years, ASEAN-led multilateralism appears increasingly under strain and in some areas marginalized. So what are the key challenges facing regional multilateralism today, and how can it be revitalized? Over to you again, Kai.
Yes, I think it's really a good question because, in my view, right now we call it ASEAN-led regionalism or ASEAN-led regional multilateralism is facing three challenges. The first challenge is from the U.S. As Kevin mentioned, U.S. Since the second Trump administration, then U.S. already withdraw from many international organizations. So the return of we call the American First policy actually revive the suspicions and also the doubt about the U.S. commitment, the long-term commitment to multilateralism. In the Asia-Pacific region, the U.S. Still participate in we call the ASEAN-led multilateral institutions. However, in recent years, the U.S. has already shifted its interest from regional multilateralism to we call the mini-lateralism, which is a limited number of countries with not inclusive agenda, but exclusive, nature, focus on certain issues. Originally, those mini-laterals supposed to be play a complementary role, to the ASEAN-led, multilateralism. However, in recent years, we find out those kind of the mini-lateralism, the development actually has already threatened, the ASEAN centrality, which is the basis of regional multilateralism, and also lead to the growing fragmentation of institutions. So that's the first challenge from the US. The second challenge actually from China. China's policy different from the US. China is really strongly embrace this called the regional multilateralism. Besides the Belt Road Initiative, China also proposed several very important, we call the global initiatives, which is to try to rebuild or reshape the regional order and the international order. However, the problem is, regional countries got still suspicious about China because they questioned the inclusiveness of those institutions, they questioned the transparency of those institutions, eventually they question about the future intentions of those institutions. So in other words, China's institutional activism, the very active behavior in regionalism or multilateralism has not translated to a widely accepted leadership in the region. So that's the second challenge from China. The third challenge, which is, I think, is really, really important, which is from ASEAN itself. ASEAN have 11 countries right now, but I think the relevance of ASEAN in the regional multilateralism in the future is depending on the cohesion of this organization. But right now, we see a lot of internal problem of ASEAN, from the border dispute between Cambodia and Thailand to long-term, humanitarian and also political crisis in Myanmar. Those kind of internal problems actually undermine the relevance of ASEAN in regional affairs because it will undermine the ability for ASEAN to have a collective action. So that's I think the most important challenge for ASEAN, how to recover its coherence among their members. So the bottom line is, as Kevin asked, yes, a lot of doubts about whether ASEAN still matters. My answer is ASEAN-led regional multilateralism still matters. However, both the outsider and also ASEAN itself, they should have realistic expectation about what ASEAN can do and what ASEAN cannot do. So we have to set the right expectation to encourage ASEAN to reform its existing institution and propose more inclusive institution. So the ASEAN will work best if the ASEAN regionalism can channel the competition between great power, not become a target of those kind of great power rivalry. Thank you.
Thank you. And Keith, as a good Canadian, in a world of geopolitical competition, can small and middle powers play a role? And your Prime Minister definitely feels that they could. And how can these states contribute constructively to regional peace and stability amid growing strategic competition?
Sure. I want to make 3 or 4 points in response to this. A reference has already been made to Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos, which really has been has served for many people as a call to action for middle and smaller powers to cooperate on a larger stage, and certainly not to look forward to American or anybody else's leadership. The first thing we should note, though, is that many of the states that need to cooperate are not actually middle powers. You need Germany and you need France and Britain and the United Kingdom and others. And at least 2 of those states are of course, nuclear powers and permanent members of the Security Council. You also need, of course, Japan, which plays a strong regional and global role. And I think that this means we need a new language here, because it's not just middle powers, it's also relatively strong states who have to take a coherent leading role, not just in their region, but beyond. The second thing I would say is that there is, Prime Minister Carney also said that the rules-based order was never what people made it out to be. It was often not respected by Western states and great powers, and it was viewed as hypocritical in many parts of the world. The example of Gaza is flagrant, but it's certainly not the only one in the last couple of decades. And so there has to be a recognition that new coalitions cannot tolerate double standards, and that there has to be a much stronger acknowledgement of diversity and diverse views that come to the table. That means that this new coalition has to include Brazil's, Indonesia's, Nigeria's, South Africa's, Kenya's, Thailand's, other states that may not share the same approach or are the same values in all cases, but will have some common interests, at least around specific issues. And this will mean that this, whatever emerges, will be a form of cooperation that is flexible, not necessarily very broad, maybe not even centered around the UN. I think we can debate that. And we'll focus on particular issues. There are various labels for this: mini-lateralism, cross-regional cooperation, regional cooperation, but with great powers. And I think it's going to be a very fragmented and diverse and complex order that emerges. But at least the first step has been taken, which is a growing recognition that in the last 12 or 18 months, we really have to find new ways of cooperating and collaborating.
Thank you. Kai, can you sort of also comment here as well about how might small and medium-sized states, the kinds of countries that Keith was just talking about, navigate and shape the turbulence associated with potential order transition in the Asia-Pacific region?
Thank you for the question, because I'm from Australia. The Australian see itself as a middle power. Against the backdrop of US-China rivalry, indeed, those middle power or small powers, they face a lot of challenges. But in my view, it's not only challenge, actually also give them opportunities. Why? Because US-China, they compete for what? They compete for leadership in the region. But the leadership needs what? Needs followers, need a followership. Those kind of followership means you need a support from middle power and the small power, right? So that's kind of give the middle power and the small power some leverage. However, the key is those middle power and the small power, they have to work together. So work together, they can help to shape the existing rules and norms in the region. So that's the key. So they have to work together. So let me give you an example about the ASEAN countries. If those ASEAN countries, they can have a unified policy in South China Sea, they will help to moderate, the behavior of great power in that region. And they can even push China to sign the Code of Conduct in South China Sea. Okay, similarly, if those middle power and the small power, they work together, Then, in international relations, we have a term called the soft balancing, or we call the, strategic non-cooperation, which is they work together, say no to a great power when a great power, violate the international norms and the laws. Okay, that's kind of the what the small power and the middle power can do. Okay, and because right now is a big debate about what the future world will look like, because people predict in the future we are going to have a multipolar, unipolar world or bipolar world. But according to a political scientist, Amitav Acharya from American University, actually we are currently face is a world -1. The one is the US, because the US become a challenger of the existing international order. So according to Acharya, those other power, which is including the small power, middle power, and also the great power of China, they can work together and to push back the behavior of, we call the US. There's a new term of US, which is called, predatory, hegemon. Predatory hegemon. It's a recent article by Stephen Walt in Foreign Affairs. So basic idea, those other power can push back the behavior of the predatory hegemon, then later on encourage the US to return or re-engage the international society. Let me focus on the ASEAN's role, because we talk about the ASEAN a lot, because the regionalism is built on the ASEAN's efforts, because a lot of criticism is ASEAN too weak. Okay, but in my view, the weakness of ASEAN is also its strength. The reason is because ASEAN is not a great power. Okay, so ASEAN can play a middle power role to provide a platform, inclusive platform, to engage the great power, and can provide a platform for the great power, middle power, to talk to each other, to dialogue, to negotiate, and to de-escalate something, some problem or the potential crisis among them. So the bottom line for me is I really endorse what, Case talk about, Mark Carney's statement of call for collective action of middle power for the future international order. But in my view, I have to emphasize middle power alone, they cannot maintain peace. So they have to find a way to work with great power. So the future international peace will be sustained by coordinated behavior between middle power and great power. I think that's the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope we have a chance to sort of discuss some of these things at the end. Keith, geopolitical rivalry has undermined cooperative security and cooperation, the things that you're focused on here at Toda, and cooperation itself has become transactional. How can longer-term interests in peace and security building be restored?
Let me start by saying something about geopolitical rivalry. It has always existed. So that isn't what's new. I think what's new is that we have powers that are revisionist, that either want to disregard, revise, or otherwise ignore the existing rules. And it's not just the United States, obviously. I think we need to acknowledge that there are many challengers to the system. So when you have rivalry plus an attempt to rewrite the rules, you are in a very dangerous situation. And I think that that's the reality we're in. There's also the case that diplomacy has always been, in some sense, transactional, but we have come out of an era where states paid attention to their longer-term interests in such things as arms control, for example, or economic cooperation, or even cooperation on things such as promoting human rights and other such things. And that's gone. We now have very short-term interests, sometimes even personal interests, Donald Trump and his family and investors, and that's something I think that's quite new. So one way around this, and it's a long-term problem, is to try and link these different issues. Some issues will matter to some states a great deal. Other issues will matter to other states. Some will want economic cooperation, others will want security assurances, and there will be trade-offs between economic and political issues. This is not new. At the height of the Cold War, the East-West conflict managed to come up with different baskets that recognize interests across a very sharp ideological divide, that recognize security concerns, economic and technological cooperation, and basic humanitarian needs. So the lesson from that is that we need to have a broad approach to how we think about security, in a sense, which is not just military security, but guaranteeing the economic security of states and regions, climate, which I think we're going to talk more about after the break, human rights and human security. And this is probably the only way to link issues across regions and across this very diverse world. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. I agree with Kai that we need the smaller and middle powers and groupings like this ASEAN need to work with the major powers, but right now they're not listening, the major powers, and that is, I think, the challenge that makes the situation so dangerous.
Great, thanks. Is there any prospect for stable peace, Keith, when there's so much global inequality, and how does inequality undermine trust worldwide? As we said earlier on, that the East Asian peace was really kind of driven to some extent by shared development models. So is there any prospect when global inequality seems to be on the increase?
Yeah, I think here we should link our understanding of what promotes peace in the long term with some of the dramatic economic transformations that have occurred and have very deep roots from roughly the 1970s when the wave of globalization started. There is no doubt that it brought huge benefits, in particular to East and Southeast Asia through the developmental peace, and benefits in other regions as well. But the paradox is that it also increased and was accompanied with massive inequalities within as well as between states. So much of the discontent in the United States is from those people who have been left behind by the process of globalization, who have seen their jobs offshored and sent elsewhere. And this is also true for populist movements in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in parts of Western Europe. So the economic transformation is not separate from the quest for a stable peace. And we need to recognize that when something like 1% of the world's population owns 50% of the wealth, and 40% of the population has 1% of the wealth, that this is going to be a source of conflict and tension within and between states. So we need to not think of just geopolitics, but also what underlies that in domestic politics. And I think that none of the major financial or development institutions could talk about inequality for the last couple of decades, but they are starting to. And this is going to require a concerted effort within our states and at the global level.
This is a question for both of you. I know that hope is at a bit of a premium here at the moment, and that many of you were stunned by the kind of the Japanese election and its consequences. One of the things which I keep wondering about is how can we maintain hope in the face of all of the things that are inducing pessimism and despair? So I'd like you both to just address that question. I mean, how significant is hopefulness in beginning to kind of transform negative dynamics into positive ones?
Personally, I'm an optimistic person, so I really want to see, because as many colleagues, especially Stein's work, East Asian already maintained peace for a long time, relatively, is amazing, what we call achievement or miracle. Okay, we want to sustain the peace in this region. In my view, I agree with Kate just said, okay, the small power definitely need to work with the great power, but how about those great power, they don't listen to what the great small power or middle power, says, okay, what kind of those middle power, small power can do. Okay, in my view, first they have to work together. They have to have a collective action, not individually challenge the great power. I think that's a lot of risk for individual countries, small power, middle power, to challenge the US or challenge China, okay? But they have to work together. The second strategy is they have to work through international institutions, regional institutions. So that's why I would like to emphasize the importance of ASEAN-led, regional institutions. Because if you tell the great power, no matter it's China and the US, saying this is not my country or my individual country's voice or view, it is the institutional view, then it's not only protect your country's interests, but also give more pressure to the great power. I think, this should work cleverly.
Thanks very much. And what gives you grounds for hopefulness, Keith?
Well, I want to start with a cautionary note. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, Europeans would have said, we have managed 40 or 50 years of peace. We are a model for the world. This is an excellent situation. And now we're faced with a huge land war in Europe based on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So peace is always fragile. And that's maybe the first thing you need to recognize before you get too optimistic. My source of hope, which I think comes from talking to and observing young people, is that many of them recognize the need for solidarity and the need to work locally. So when I talk about inequality, it's something that can be addressed at the community and at the local level, because we've, in some senses, failed with the great global visions. And maybe it's time for some more modest but very practical steps to work to build solidarity and trust within communities and between states and build regions. The UN was a very top-down vision of how change would be achieved. Now it might be time for a bottom-up vision that recognizes what needs to be done in different regions according to their needs and interests and values. And that gives me some hope, because that is what you see in different parts of the world.
Thank you both very much. I think we're nearly...